Before it became a worldwide phenomenon, before millions of trainers set out on their journey, before we knew them as icons, there was just a kid and a love for collecting bugs. This is the story of the game that started it all. The game that no one expected to change the world. The first Pokemon game. But first, we have to go back to Japan in the 1980s. It's a world of endless possibilities as the computer age takes over the world. Japan is producing all matters of computer electronics, and it's a time of economic stability and growth. But also it's a world without Pokemon.
Satoshi Tajiri loves video games, but he also has a passion for collecting bugs. So much so that like people call me the Pokémon Professor because of my love of Pokémon. So did too his friends called him Dr. Bug for his love of bugs. However, when I say father of Pokémon, what are some of the words that come to mind? I'm guessing Rebel probably isn't one of them. But Tajiri was a person who moved against the grain of traditional Japanese society. He was considered an otaku, a term which contemporary meaning was first coined in 1983. Otakus are people who are highly interested in some form of quote-unquote alt culture, typically anime, manga, video games, or computers. Otaku had a negative connotation behind it, however. It was used to describe those who were obsessed with their field of interest at the cost of their social skills and love life. I believe the West had a similar problem with the term geek and nerd.
But despite this, Tajiri was a pioneer of otaku culture. Also, he moved outside the lines of what was expected of a typical Japanese man at the time. He opted out of going to college in favor of going to a 2-year technical school, where he majored in electronics and computer science. Upon graduation, his father would attempt to get Tajiri a job as an electrical technician. Tajiri would refuse this, and instead, in 1983, he released the first issue of Game Freak magazine, a fanzine that Tajiri would handwrite and illustrate himself before sending off to a printer and selling it for 300 yen, and feature various strategies on playing arcade games. Game Freak magazine would amass a following and readers would write in. This is where Tajiri would meet Ken Sugimori, a fellow illustrator and lover of video games. Ken would lend his drawing skills to Tajiri and Game Freak magazine. They would play video games together and talk about video game development and what they would do differently if they were to make their own game. As the years went on and the reach of Game Freak magazine grew more and more, the more and more people they would have write in. Eventually, Ken and Tajiri would meet like-minded people who were programmers that had the hardware to make video games. This is where the two would meet Junichi Masuda, a composer and programmer. And so, together, Satoshi Tajiri, Ken Sugimori, and Junichi Masuda started to work together, and on April 26, 1989, they took Game Freak, the magazine, and turned it into Game Freak, the video game development studio.
Who's that Pokemon? Action. It's
Growlithe. Years prior to opening Game Freak, Tajiri was working on what would be their first game, Quinty. By the time Quinty was released, home consoles had taken over and the arcade scene was on its last leg, even in Japan. However, Quinty was decidedly old school and reminiscent of the bright and colorful graphics Tajiri and Sugimori loved. Quinty was a puzzle game with simple controls that were designed to be easily picked up and played. The game can be played by a single player or by 2 players in co-op. Each level consisted of a 5x7 grid of floor surrounded by a boundary wall. At the beginning of each level, a number of enemy dolls would appear and start to wander around to attempt to collide with the player. The characters have the ability to flip the floor tile that they are standing on, or an adjacent one in order to propel enemy dolls away, as well as revealing new floor tiles underneath. Enemies can be destroyed by flipping them into a wall or an impassable block. For 5 years, Tajiri worked on Quinty until it was released June 27, 1989. Tajiri served as the director, designer, and producer, while Sugimori did the art and Masuda composed the music. Namco's Xevious was Tajiri's favorite game growing up. That, coupled with the fact that Quinty was inspired by cute and colorful games like Pac-Man, made Namco the perfect publisher for Quinty. But while Namco served as Quinty's publisher in Japan, Tajiri thought it would work well in the US market. So, he got on a plane and drove around the West Coast pitching his game to different publishers. Most would reject his game on the grounds of it being too cutesy. That video games needed to exude a certain amount of macho manliness, reminiscent of VHS covers to action movies that were popular at the time. Oftentimes, video games imported from Japan would have their covers changed to be more realistic and depict a much darker tone than what was actually in the game. This made finding a publisher for Quinty difficult, but not impossible. Eventually, Quinty was picked up by Hudson Soft. They localized the game as Mindell Palace in the US and changed the box art so that the characters were less cute in order to reflect America's more realistic and darker aesthetic.
Who's that Pokemon? Action.
It's
Ghastly.
In 1989, the same year Game Freak would release Quinty, Nintendo released something that would touch the lives and inspire people all over the world. The Game Boy. One of those people was Satoshi Tajiri, who after seeing the Game Boy for the first time had something click in his mind. It was especially something about the Game Boy's data transfer cable, the Game Link cable, that spoke to him. He thought about transferring living organisms through the cable.
For Tajiri, it wasn't about competition, but rather he liked the idea of one-on-one communication. From a philosophical standpoint, Tajiri saw the cable as representative of the Japanese concept of respect, like two people bowing to each other before a karate match. He thought back to his childhood, watching TV and seeing Ultraman use his capsule monsters to aid him in battle, playing video games at the arcade, and the love of hunting, collecting, and trading bugs. He thought of a game that would have everything he loved rolled up into one. But fitting these ideas into one cartridge, now that would be a challenge.
Shigesato Itoi would start a company called Ape, a company that would help Nintendo develop their games. Upon forming the company, Itoi would send out a call to action to all those who wanted to make games with Nintendo. Tajiri saw this as Game Freak's chance to pitch a new game, Capsule Monsters, or Capumon as it was often shortened to by the game devs at Game Freak. Capsule Monsters, which would one day be called Pokémon, was an RPG. You start off in Pallet Town. You leave home and head to Professor Oak's laboratory and make the hardest choice of your life. Which starter Pokemon will be yours? Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle? And once you choose Squirtle, okay, I'm biased, you head out to capture more Pokemon by battling them. You raise your Pokemon partners you capture and use them to battle trainers to level up. Eventually, once you're strong enough, you can challenge the 8 gyms that will get you badges that will prove your worth and allow you to battle the Elite Four. You beat the Elite Four, you challenge your rival, and you become Pokemon League champion. The pitch for Capsule Monsters went well. But after realizing how long and difficult the development would be, Nintendo suggested Game Freak work on a smaller project as a way to study the development process of the Game Boy and get more experience. The game was simply called Yoshi, and it was a puzzle game for the Game Boy and NES. Nintendo gave Game Freak only 6 months to develop the game. Despite this short amount of time, this gave Game Freak and Tajiri the chance to work with the likes of Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi, the father of the Game Boy. Tajiri's relationship with Yokoi was especially impactful. This was a full circle moment of the Game Boy inspiring Tajiri to create Capumon and Yokoi, the father of the Game Boy, inspiring him even further.
その時のその横井さんに教えられたことって何ですかね。僕の親父ぐらいのこう年の差だったんですよ。なんか人柄としては全然年上じゃなくて、頭が柔軟で、なんか心が中小企業っていうのかな、なんかこうアイディア一つで何かが爆発するっていうかね、人に影響を与えられるんやっていうようなね、アイディアが浮かぶようなヒントを与えてくれる っていうことをすごく上手い人だったんですよね。ああ、この主の卵で言ったらその逆でいいんちゃうの。そう好きに作らせてもくれるところと、ここをこうした方がいいっていう時のそのコメントの強弱っていうのははっきりしてるから。
Yoshi was a success and cemented Game Freak's and Nintendo's relationship. After the success of Yoshi, Game Freak started back development of Capumon, now called Pocket Monsters or Pokémon, as it was often called during development. Work began with Tajiri directing, Sugimori doing the art, and Masuda composing the music and programming. And it would be in development for 6 years, which is a long time even by today's standards. Almost as if Game Freak was getting back at Nintendo for that 6-month time limit. Throughout Pokemon's development, Game Freak would release 7 titles between 1989 and 1996 to help make ends meet while they were developing Pocket Monsters. The Pocket Monsters and their abilities were made separately, and then later on, once those abilities were finalized, the monster was given the ability that made most sense for them and their design. After that came the constant tweaking and balancing of each and every Pocket Monster. And with Masuda being one of the few programmers at the time, meant dealing with these issues firsthand. His computer constantly would overheat and break down, and despite his best efforts to keep them working, he still went through 4 computers in the 6-year development cycle. But in spite of all this, Pocket Monsters would never move to the more powerful Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo as it was called in the US. The team believed that the core of Pocket Monsters was the one-on-one, face-to-face aspect of the game, such as trading. A concept that Tajiri would get from a Dragon Quest game and a Magic Hat.
すごい低い確率でこうラッキーな道具を拾えるっていうかさ、ムースさんからもらうことができて、不思議な帽子っていうのがあって、スマホをちょっとこう、数十%節約してかけられるみたいなね、帽子があるんですよ。で、それをうちのグラフィックの担当のエビモリなんかは2つ持ってるわけです。俺は持ってないです。低い確率でもらえるから価値があるんだけど、俺はなくてエビモリが2つ持ってるともらえる。で、もらえねえかなっていう話を当時よくしてたわけよ。どうもしようがない。どこにどっちが勝てたですかね。で、その時のこう不思議な帽子を俺も欲しいって思ってた体験と、そのゲームボーイの通信機能っていうのを見た時に、あ、これだ、これでやり取りが帽子でやり取りできるぞっていう。Contrary
to popular belief, the original point wasn't for one person to buy both versions of the game. The idea of splitting up Pokemon into 2 different versions with certain Pokemon exclusive to each one was suggested by Shigeru Miyamoto, and meant that players would need to find a friend with the other versions of the game to trade with. This would encourage players to socialize with others while capturing Tajiri's love for collecting and trading bugs. And in 2009, Masuda would talk about Pokemon with the twice-defunct G4. One of the core aspects of the Pokemon games is trading. You can trade within the game, but you can also go out and meet with your friends to trade. You can talk with your family and friends as you play Pokemon. For this concept, the most suitable hardware is portable, like a Nintendo DS. That's why we focus on portable game systems. I wonder if Tajiri, an otaku, ever smiled at the irony of creating games that so strongly emphasize connecting and sharing with others, while the otaku culture in the 1980s was so heavily criticized for being antisocial. But having that as the core idea, the team at Game Freak would move forward with Pocket Monsters development while working on other games. Game Freak had produced well-received games, but they had yet to have a real hit on their hands. This put a lot of pressure on the team for Pocket Monsters to perform well. But Game Freak as a collective kept Pocket Monsters going, fueled by the passion they had for the project. Masuda would say at Game Freak at the time, back when we first started making games, we could hardly even be called a company at the time. We were almost like a college club or something, where people who were interested would just gather and hang out. They come to work whenever they want, leave whenever they want. Some people will be sleeping over because they worked so hard into the night. Junichi Masuda, Polygon. The team voted on their favorite Pocket Monster designs and reduced 300 or so down to 150. Even so, fitting all those different Pokemon onto cartridges would be difficult, even after splitting them into 2 different cartridges. Memory was an ever short resource for Game Freak. To help with this, they came up with unique solutions like having the map tiles move while your character animated in place, giving the illusion of movement. Despite the shortage on memory, this wouldn't stop Shigeki Morimoto from creating a 151st Pokemon. Described as a bit of a prank by Morimoto, this would have a heavy impact on the success of the series. But more on that later. Don't be greedy. As Pocket Monsters got closer to its release date, Game Freak was faced with another issue. The Game Boy came out in 1989. By the time Pocket Monsters was being released, many believed the nearly 6-year-old console was at the end of its lifespan. To put it into perspective, when they started developing Pocket Monsters, the Super Nintendo was a brand new console. And the same year that they would release Pocket Monsters, Nintendo would also release the N64. The Game Boy would need a successor soon from Nintendo, or its market share could be taken by a newer and more powerful competitor. Not here. This meant that Game Freak spent the last 6 years developing a game for a console that was at the end of its life cycle. And to add more difficulty, Game Freak was running out of money. You know, the things that keep companies running? And there was worries about how they would pay their employees. But after 6 years of development, the game was ready to be released in 1995. And Nintendo delayed the game because it was at the end of their fiscal year. So, Pocket Monsters Red and Green was released the following year on February 27th, 1996.
Who's that Pokemon? Action.
It's Magikarp.
Once the game was released, the team at Game Freak went to different stores to see how the game was selling. According to Masuda, they didn't really know how received the game was until they started seeing it in the newspaper and new media was being created, such as the trading card game and anime. Because Pokemon was released with little to no press, it would take something gigantic for it to catch on. Without social media, word of mouth was crucial. And let me tell you, there was one thing in particular they were talking about.
At the end of the Pocket Monsters development cycle, the debugging process had ended, and as such, the debugging software used to test and fix the game was removed. This left just enough space for Morimoto to put in his secret 151st Pokemon, despite being told multiple times not to make any changes after the debugging process was over. Described as a bit of a prank by Morimoto, Mew was never meant to be discoverable by the player, but a rare and highly difficult to replicate glitch had Mew appear in the game, almost as if he broke something by adding something after the debugging process was over. Because the glitch was rare and hard to replicate, rumors spread like wildfire about the mysterious 151st Pokemon. As word of Mew spread, so did Japan's awareness of Pokemon. With the glitch being difficult to replicate, the one way to get him was to attempt to trade if you had a generous friend, and I mean really generous friend. But to everyone's surprise, including Game Freak, Nintendo held a special event where they gave away Mew to players. Once the rumors started spreading, Nintendo partnered with Japanese publication CoroCoro Comic to hold a contest to distribute Mew to 20 players. 78,000 players entered the contest, and the winners had to send in their game cartridge to receive Mew. The monthly sales we had up until then began to be equaled by the weekly sales, before increasing to become 3 then 4 times larger. After the success of Pocket Monsters Green and Red, Game Freak would release Pocket Monster Blue in Japan, but only by mail order. This version would have updated graphics. At this point, there's 3 different versions of the game. That's important for later. With great sales and an anime a little over a year after the game's launch, a ton of merchandise, it was safe to say Pocket Monsters was a hit in Japan and proved that the Game Boy still had life.
Who's that Pokemon? Action.
It's
Dragonair.
A man is walking the streets of Japan when he notices everyone talking about or playing a new game he's never heard of. The game is Pocket Monsters, obviously. And the man is Al Khan, the very man responsible for taking Cabbage Patch Kids from a small business and turning it into a global phenomenon. While visiting Japan, he realizes just how popular Pocket Monster is and thought it would be perfect for the American market. He would then pitch this idea to Nintendo. Nintendo was originally apprehensive. As mentioned before, it was believed that an American audience wouldn't like games that were too cutesy. But Khan believed in Pocket Monsters. Except for the name. Khan didn't like the name Pocket Monsters. He wanted something, and I quote, more Japanesey, something that would differentiate the brand in America. And thus, Pocket Monsters officially became Pokémon. The team at Game Freak would not localize Pokémon Red and Green for the US, but would instead localize the updated Pokémon Blue in the States. Thus, Japan's Blue version would be released as Pokémon Red and Pokémon Blue in the US. The game would have the updated graphics while making sure there were still Pokémon exclusive to each version to encourage trading. Game Freak decided to call the localized version of Pokémon Red and Blue instead of Pokémon Red and Green because red and blue are the colors in the American flag. So, to summarize, even though the American version of Pokémon Red and Blue was based off Pocket Monster Blue from Japan, Nintendo called it Pokémon Red and Blue instead of Pokémon Red and Green because red and blue are the colors of the American flag and they thought it would be more palatable for an American audience, despite the fact the man whose idea it was to bring Pokemon to America didn't like the name Pocket Monsters because he didn't think it was Japanese enough. Does that make sense to you? But as they started localizing the game for the US, they realized that language would be a problem. Many of the Pokemon and main human characters had very Japanese names, a lot of which were puns that would be lost on a US audience. Nintendo of America made the choice to carefully change certain names in the game. For instance, the second gym leader in the game is named Kasumi, which means mist. So in English, they changed her name to Misty. This was done to make the name accessible for a US audience while still staying true to the original pun and meaning of the name. The other issue was language, literally. The cartridge was already packed full of data, and to Game Freak's dismay, the English language took up more space than the Japanese. And upon attempting to change the language for the US audience, the development team at Game Freak realized that they couldn't simply swap out Japanese for English. Pokémon Red and Green spent 6 years in development. The more a game spends in development, the higher the risk of the game breaking if you make a change like adding something or taking something out. This is why developers even today will opt to hide things in video games rather than taking them out and risking completely breaking the game. Pokemon's infrastructure was built in such a way that they couldn't simply swap out the language. The game would need to be completely reprogrammed. Game Freak would work tirelessly to do so, leading to a longer than usual development time. Now, I won't be showing clips from this next part, but the next obstacle came December 16th, 1997, less than a year from the US launch. It was an episode of Pocket Monsters named Dino Senshi Porygon. This episode shows Pikachu doing a thunder shock and causing a bright flashing light that led to over 700 people being hospitalized for epileptic seizures. Most of them recovered that day, with some having to stay overnight. To make matters worse, as the Japanese news reported on the incidents, they showed clips from the episode triggering more seizures. Production of the Pokemon anime was shut down for 4 months as the Japanese investigated. This news story captivated the world and it was shared internationally.
Almost every Japanese child knows Pocket Monsters and its star Pakucho. They play the Nintendo computer game. They even sing the Pocket Monsters song. Millions were glued to the latest cartoon episode when a flashing explosion created from these slowed down images triggered convulsions in hundreds of children. Many were kept in hospital for over 24 hours. Often those affected had no history of epilepsy. More children had fits when excerpts were replayed on the news. Doctors said victims were shocked into a kind of hypnotic trance. parents are alarmed.
I always thought it was a cute program that was fine for kids, but now I have to be careful about everything they watch.
I don't know who Pikachu is, but in what would eventually be dubbed Pokemon Shock by some, this was Americans' introduction to Pocket Monsters. To many Americans, the first time hearing the words Pocket Monsters for the first time was quickly followed by the words TV cartoon flashes send 700 Japanese into seizures, or Japanese monsters attack children. Thankfully, according to an article from the NIH, there were no long-lasting effects from the incident. Gail Tilden was heading the marketing and the localization of Pokemon in the US and opted to release the Pokemon game and the Pokemon anime simultaneously instead of relying solely on the success of the game to launch the franchise in the US. And thanks to her, and a combination of the anime, games, and merchandise, Pokemon just didn't come to the US. It took over, and it felt like it happened overnight. And so, the Pokemon game that Satoshi Tajiri created to connect people by sharing hadn't just taken over Japan or the US, it took over the world.
Who's that Pokemon? Action.
That's just a man.
Oh God, what is that? Oh,
It's a ditto.
It's a ditto.
Some say that Pokemon was painstakingly planned by Nintendo to take over the world and ensnare the minds of children and their parents' wallets. Truth is, I believe that Nintendo didn't even realize what they had and consistently underestimated it, even when it came to the US and underestimating the value of Pokemon licensing and losing money on it. Some also say that Pokemon captivated its audience with simple, bright colored characters and a few game mechanics. And perhaps there's truth in that. But I think the real secret to Pokemon's success is Tajiri's idea of one-on-one connection. What caused Pokemon to blow up in Japan was word of mouth. And I think the same thing happened in the US. A lot of us have memories of trading Pokemon with friends or trading with the cards. We remember talking about the game with our friends and families. And even if you didn't share your love with Pokemon outside of yourself, there was perhaps the most important connection. Connection between you and the Pokemon in the game. Tajiri would say, in Japan, everybody goes for Pikachu. In the US, the character Ash, or Satoshi in Japan, and Pikachu are grouped together. American kids seem to like that. In America, there are more products sold with Ash and Pikachu together, not just Pikachu alone. I think Americans actually understand the concept of Pokemon better than the Japanese. The Japanese focus on Pikachu. What I think is important is the human aspect. You need Ash. Tajiri and Game Freak understood what made Pokemon great was the connection between the Pokemon and the human. And I think it's because they felt the same connection too. Pokemon is a huge corporation now, even outside of Nintendo. But back in the 90s, before the game's release, it was pretty much equated to a passion project that was kept alive by the people that believed in it. They didn't know Pokemon would be this global phenomenon. They just wanted to make a great game. If Satoshi Tajiri is the father of Pokemon, then Ken Sugimori and Junichi Masuda are the uncles. All three joined the company as idealists who loved games, who were drawn together by Tajiri's magazine. When the game came out, it didn't follow a lot of gaming trends at the time. It was just what a small group of people wanted to play. And all 3 are still involved with Pokemon to this day. But that's just my opinion. Thank you all for watching. I've been Elijah Lee. This has been a Pikachu. Thank you for watching and see you guys next time. Also, if you like the video, please